Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be able to do this online. I was joking earlier that this is the first time I've ever given a public talk from a private space. So I am in my home in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but as Ashley said, I'm originally from Canada. I'm really honored to be invited to DiverseWorks, and I really commend the amazing staff there. Ashley, Zandra, everyone that I've met and spoken with has been so understanding, and I also want to really thank DiverseWorks for being able to pivot so quickly. We're all living through unprecedented times, and they quickly realized that there was an opportunity for us to move our work online, including this lecture, as well as I changed it. First, I thought that I was going to give a talk about sound and indigeneity, and I decided to shift, in part because I've been doing research about colonialism and pandemics and the infectious nature of capitalism for over a decade now. So I thought that instead, given the current pandemic, I would shift gears and share with you a rather older story, one that originates from my community in the Yukon, but one that I think is particularly pertinent to tell now and to tell today. And as Ashley mentioned, if you have any questions, you feel free to state them in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have a chance to go back and answer some of those questions. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to the virtual audience, even though I can't see your faces. I'm very grateful to be able to share this with you today. So think of this maybe as a bit of a podcast, because I'll be reading a story, and it's a story within a story. So it's both a historical event, as well as a story that's been passed down to me through my relatives about, you could say, two different origins of the Klondike Gold Rush in the 1800s, as well as different origins of the Potlatch. So I'll begin. The docking of two steamships, the Excelsior and the Portland, filled with gold mined from Canada's Yukon territory, and then newly rich prospectors, was perhaps the single most significant event to take place on the West Coast during the late 1800s. It immediately boosted the economies of individual cities, as well as that of the country as a whole. It brought the intricate relationships between belief, in this instance, belief in the potential for economic prosperity, and I think this is an important point given the way that our president is speaking at the moment, capitalist desire and wealth into public consciousness. When the Excelsior, and that's the ship you see here, arrived in San Francisco's port on July 15th, 1897, it caused a media frenzy. Photos of individuals hauling sacks and suitcases off the ship, some cargo so full of the precious metal that it required more than one person to lift, quickly circulated in local news media. But it was in fact the Portland's arrival in Seattle just 2 days later that contained over 2 tons of gold that initiated the largest collective expedition for gold in North America's history, and in fact the history of the world at that point. And it's called the Klondike Gold Rush. With the promise of riches for anyone willing to undertake the journey north, between 40 and 80,000 people abandoned their previous lives to become prospectors, suppliers, showgirls, and to pursue numerous other vernacular vocations in an environment that was utterly foreign to them, because the Yukon is subarctic and Arctic. And while the rush seemed to start overnight, gold had in fact been found and mined in the Yukon for nearly a quarter of a century prior to the big strike. But because of its harsh climate, the Klondike presented far more personal risk to its prospectors than any of the prior gold rushes, particularly the ones in California or in Deadwood, other parts of the United States. So that meant that many never made it past the first leg of the ridiculously grueling journey across the Chilkoot Pass, which was defended by my people, the Tlingit. But this was one of the only ways to reach the interior of the mineral-rich Yukon. But these two ships arrived at a fortuitous moment. They docked just following a period of severe economic depression in the United States. That first depression was called the Panic of 1873, and it was precipitated by an overinvestment in railroads, which is a single economy with slow returns, as well as the switch from what was called bimetallism to a monometallic de facto gold standard, which was brought about by the introduction of the United States Coinage Act of 1873. Now the economy is largely leveraged by the price of oil. And this act introduced a new monetary system whereby the standard economic unit was based on the fixed weight of gold. So this overemphasis on one metal almost immediately resulted in it being perceived as scarce. So the belief in gold's scarcity and its rapid increase in value, combined with the feverish demand, had a deep impact on US citizens. That meant that they started quickly hoarding it. So it was, think of gold as the more valuable toilet paper of our time. So they were hoarding it in socks, sugar bowls, and under floorboards and in personal safes. Savings were withdrawn from banks, and this caused bank runs, and a series of economically devastating bank failures soon followed. The number of gold coins and gold certificates in active circulation was rapidly reduced, and by 1892, only 190 million in gold coin and gold certificates out of a total of 730 million remained in the US Treasury. And this morphed into outright panic in 1893 when other foreign governments lost faith that the US government could maintain its payments in gold. This was, at the time, the bleakest economic period yet experienced by the United States until now. It's not surprising then, when the two ships docked and they were loaded with the coveted metal, that the event immediately took on near mythical dimensions. The focus on gold had other unanticipated effects as well, one of which was that people began seeing it everywhere. So I'm quoting here from a book by Pierre Burton called The Klondike, and he says, "A group of Italian laborers in New York City saw gold in some sand in which they were digging and began to talk to local newspapermen of a fortune. A visitor in Victoria, British Columbia, saw gold in the outcropping of a gutter near the city's post office and tried to stake a claim on the main street. Gold started to turn up in almost every state of the Union. Trinity County, California, went wild over the alleged discovery of some old Spanish gold mines. A report from Marquette, Michigan, claimed that the town was sitting on a vein of gold that was some 40 feet wide. Peru tried to revive the gold mines of the Incas. Deadwood announced the discovery of a new gold vein. The old Caribou and Kootenai districts of British Columbia began to report new gold finds. Mexico claimed that there was gold in Yaqui country. Russia insisted that there were fabulous mines just across from Alaska. And even China talked about new discoveries." End of that quote. Yet, the gold rush had its most immediate impact in Seattle, which was the hub for gold prospectors boarding ships for the North. And documents from the period report that the city emptied out nearly overnight, and even the mayor was caught up in the craze. He was out of town during the two ships' dockings, but he sent in his resignation from afar so that he could immediately join the throngs of people heading north. So this is the Chilkoot Pass in my territory. And a detailed description of the pass is revealing. So the Northwest Mounted Police were stationed at the summit of both the Chilkoot and the White Passes. And they were stationed there to ensure that every stampeder, as they were called, was adequately outfitted to survive at least 1 year in the Klondike. And adequate for them translated into 1 ton of goods per person, including food, tents, cooking utensils, and tools. But this meant that they couldn't get their loads up in one single pass, so stampeders walked 80 miles for every single mile that they moved their provisions. So it was very slow. The worst part of the trail, and that's what's pictured here, was called the Golden Stairs. And these were 1,500 steps that were carved out of mountain ice. So stampeders moved up the stairs in a single line as they clutched a rope balustrade, carrying their goods on their backs 50 to 60 pounds a time. And the term stampede was laughable in such crowded, slow-moving conditions, because a single trip up these golden stairs could take as long as 6 hours. But on the White Pass, and that was the other main way to get into the interior Yukon, it wasn't just humans who suffered the terrain. There was Dead Horse Trail, and that's a sharp turn near the peak of the White Pass, where horses hauling their heavy loads up the side of the mountain abruptly came to a halt. With trembling legs and steam rising from their coats, they refused to go higher. Their handlers bellowed and whipped them. The heavy leather straps welted their sweat-soaked hides. And one by one, they turned and they leapt off the edge, their bodies slowly twisting in the air, their legs and necks snapping on the jagged rocks below, and the contents of their packs spilling out over their twisted remains. An estimated 3,000 horses died on the trail, and the packers recalled that having to climb over the abandoned carcasses of the horses in their path, only realizing that after stepping over them that the animals were still alive. The stampede was brief. It began in 1896, and in 3 short years, it was totally over. So this is a story that's predicated on recovering fragments of speech, fragments of sound, of tuning our ears to the voices that drown beneath the colonial din. Indigenous and colonial histories are simultaneously known and unknown. Sometimes they hover at the threshold of the audible. Freeing voices wedged beneath dominant history can redress some of the violence that has reduced Indigenous peoples, brown peoples, Indigenous lives to numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse. I think it's by dwelling in these fragments and by spending time in the discomfort of the incomplete and listening to the shards that stand in for history, it's possible to attune our ears to hear something of these stifled voices. Because the politics of colonial entanglements offer the possibility not only to hear, but to listen to silences as well. Now I want to weave in another story, and this is a story of Skookum Jim, who was one of our relatives. So think of him telling this to you right now. So it began with a dream that became a prophecy. He heard the sound first. It was a high, desperate chirp, and it grew louder and more persistent as he moved through the forest, drawing nearer. Stuck beneath the branches of a fallen spruce tree was a frog. It was glistening, because it wasn't the typical moist green. This one looked as though it was iridescent. It had speckled sides that shone like copper. In place of eyes, it had large discs of polished gold. When he picked it up, he was entranced as the light flicked back and forth, in his eyes flashing from a deep black to what seemed like a blinding white. He carefully placed the frog down near the water and surrounded it with strings of colored glass beads and goose down as payment for its visit. Despite the encounter's strangeness, a frog dream or frog encounter is a good encounter. For Tlingit people, the frog signifies wealth, and its crest adorns regalia now as it did in the past. Therefore, Kish, also known as Skookum Jim, he knew prosperity would soon follow. Yet he couldn't shake an unsettled feeling, because when the frog turned to look at him, he was overcome with a feeling of great emptiness. Because in that instant, he saw the entire human world transfixed in its gilded gaze. Soon after his dream, they started coming. Just a few at first. They were hardy ones. They had pack dogs and enough provisions to get them through the hard winters. They came up and over the Chilkoot Trail, one by one, and then up and over the White Pass with native guides. And they joined those who, like Keisha's brother-in-law, George Carmack, already knew these lands. They knew the local customs, and they had learned the languages. And some had lived in the region for more than a decade before the big strike. But they were all looking for the same thing. They were looking for elusive nuggets that glistened in the creek and riverbeds, the nuggets that held fast in the mineral veins of the bedrock. So desperate was their search that they would sometimes forgo sleep, and they would forget to hunt, they would forget to fish, preferring instead to fill their pouches with gold dust. But Quiche knew well, when the knot of hunger begins to tighten in the pit of your stomach, you can't eat gold. Some months before the stampede of prospectors, Quiche, or Skookum Jim, he was sharing a camp with his sister Sha Tla, who's also known as Kate Carmack in English texts, and Kate's husband, George Carmack, and the siblings' nephew, Kagooks, who's also known as Dawson Charlie. They were camped near the edge of Ta-Ta-Deek Creek. Quiche and Kagooks had grown used to accompanying Carmack on his endless ventures along the rivers and their tributaries in search of gold, and they had had some success. Sha Tla spent her days cutting and drying fish in the spring and summer, and moose and caribou meat in the fall. She picked blueberries and soapberries until the first frost. She dried them and she pounded them together with the meat and its fat to make pemmican, good food for winter travels, as it isn't heavy and it doesn't sour. In the winter, she sewed them thick moccasins from the smoky, tanned moose hides. It was a normal morning in mid-August. Sha Tla was up before the sun. Boiled horsetail tea was ready on the fire. Now that it was dawn, the sun streaming through the skinny strands of northern spruce, she was washing clothes down by the creek. George was already sitting on a log by the fire. He was sipping. He was watching the low flames pensively. Kagooks was slower to rise, but you could hear him rustling in his tent. Quiche mumbled greetings in Tagish before heading down to the creek to wash his face in the cold water. After focusing his eyes, he saw them, 3 nuggets, each about the size of a dime. He gathered them in his hat and he brought them up to the camp. George was electrified. He shouted and he flung his arms and legs about in a peculiar dance, and he scared the ravens out of their roosts. To whom it may concern, I do this day locate and claim by right of discovery 500 feet running upstream from this notice, located the 17th day of August, 1896, G. W. Carmack. Another sign nearby, this one hastily scrawled on a piece of birch, declared, I name this creek Bonanza, G.C., his initials. And with that, Ta-Ta-Deek became Bonanza Creek, a name that was soon on everyone's lips. And within 2 weeks, every foot of it was staked, along with its tributaries, including one that they dubbed the El Dorado. And with the planting of a sign, the power structure was transformed. Indigenous hosts were now guests in their own land. And a kind of colonialism, a new kind of colonialism had set in motion. This was not settler colonialism, as at this stage, most of the newcomers had no intent to stay, but extractive colonialism based on the acquisition of resources. After the word of the big strike on Bonanza Creek got out, the slow trickle of those initial prospectors turned into a wave. Within a year, men showed up speaking languages that Quiche had never heard before. Not just Russian, not just English, but Japanese and German and others. Despite not sharing a language, they all spoke the same common tongue, feverishly repeating the same word ad nauseum. Gold, gold, gold. These new men he saw, they all had the same empty look in there that he had first witnessed in the frog's eyes. They were transfixed by the potential of striking it rich. He knew then that there would be no going back to the old ways. So unlike at the beginnings of previous gold rushes, early rumors as well as published reports on the Yukon's burgeoning mineral wealth initially had little impact in the South. This made the arrival of those two ships that much more of a sensation. It was as though a situation of extreme desperation, of extreme economic depression had conjured its own miraculous cure. With the events surrounding the Klondike Gold Rush, the link between desire, belief, and economic prosperity was made clear. Economic prosperity was the very motor of capitalist desire and vice versa, and that hasn't changed. What these events also point to is the degree to which belief and luck remains tied to systems of exchange and ultimately to the accumulation of capital. Marcel Mauss, in a little book that he wrote in the 1920s, he describes the very origins of economic value as religious in nature. Perhaps he meant spiritual in nature as well. Economic activities, in his view, he said, retain a ceremonial character that is obligatory and effective. So no matter how distant we are from our collective origins and systems of mutual reciprocity and exchange, and that's the basis of the potlatch, which I'll get to in a second, these activities, in his view, remain full of rituals and of rites. So it was with this understanding of the idea of the magical power, the ritual and ceremony, still attached to systems of exchange, that drew four prominent Seattle businessmen to create, or rather artfully invent, the Golden Potlatch, a citywide festival that rather artfully combined the just past prosperity, because this was in 1911, so not that far after the Klondike Gold Rush, and to tether that to the mutual reciprocity operating at the heart of the potlatch, which is a customary ceremony that is still practiced among Native North American societies and communities, including my own. But you can see here, even by this image, they had no sense or no ties to the authenticity of a potlatch, because this is clearly, plains beadwork, and it isn't even in a Northwest Coast style, but they were trying to gather as many people to this, as they called Seattle's Great Carnival, as possible. So following its first iteration in 1911, the Golden Potlatch, and also the Golden Potlatch is a really important name because they're literally naming it after the metal that they're desiring, right? The Golden Potlatch. It took place annually for 3 years, and it was briefly resuscitated between 1935 and 1941. And it actually continues today, but in a much different form. It's called the Seafair Celebrations. So central to the festival was an elaborate performance of what we might call sympathetic magic, which included the reenactment of the docking of the Portland, the ship that carried all the gold, complete with a small-scale replica of that original ship. And so the organizers, in combining the optimism and the promise of wealth associated with the gold rush, along with the communal gifting and redistribution of wealth characteristic of the potlatch, from their view anyway, were perhaps ignorant of the fact that the potlatch ceremonies at that time in both the United States and Canada were illegal. And at the time, this ban was rigorously enforced by missionaries and Indian agents as part of extreme assimilationist policies in both countries. And people were indeed jailed. They had their belongings taken away, sold from underneath them, and given to museums. So it formed the basis of major collections at the Museum of Civilization, the Royal Ontario Museum, as well as the National Museum of the American Indian, because they were sold to the collector George Gustav Hay. So the Potlatch Ban was only repealed in Canada in 1951. In the US, perhaps where it was seen as less of a threat to capitalism, the ban was dropped in 1934. But during the ban, when ceremonies were not forced to halt altogether, they continued in a more subdued form, or they moved underground, so as not to attract the attention of overzealous missionaries and Indian agents. And it was in the opinion of Indian agents at the time that the potlatch which is the very backbone of many Northwest Coast Native societies. It's the way people get married, it's the way they get their names, it's the way that you celebrate the birth of a child, it's the way that you bestow the leadership of a community. So it's a governance and a justice structure as well. They declared that it was, and I quote, a worse than useless custom. It was regarded as wasteful, unproductive, and contrary to civilized values. And even more curious than this public reemergence in the early 1900s in a rather bastardized form, the Golden Potlatch. So this postcard was also pretty fascinating to me. Official invitations to the 1911 Golden Potlatch circulated in the form of beautifully typeset postcards. A particularly compelling example included an image of Siwash Indian wear sellers flanked by portraits of Chief Seattle and Princess Angeline. And the tagline promised a hot time in a cool place, as you see. So they were trying to create an association between the potlatch with local figures who are known well, including both Princess Angeline and Chief Seattle, as a means of adding further legitimacy to the event. But you can understand here that their idea of their mimicry or the mimesis kind of went wild, because these people wearing their totem pole, these totem poles for hats, none of those, of course, are authentic. They're all an approximation or a kind of extreme idea of mimicry of what they think the original is. So the 1912 edition, and this is a picture from that, was much more elaborate. 250 full-scale plaster replicas of model totem poles were erected throughout the city, along with other public ceremonial markers. And major events included a large parade down Main Street, as well as plays, initiations that were done to quite literally infect the public with what they called festival spirit, and a daily media blitz that consisted of press releases containing poetry, news, songs, and images to further promote the event. The parade was an unabashed advertising gesture. It was, on one hand, intended to boost the city's economy, and it also functions as a form of social narration. So demonstration through public spectacle, parades assist in solidifying connections with their audiences. They're a kind of tableau, and they rely on elaborate symbolism to tell spectators a particular story about society as they pass by. They might also try to create a kind of consensual idea of what the future might be. So the story of the Golden Potlatch was one of organized optimism, and this is actually the advertiser's words, organized optimism. During the parade, different ethnic groups were displayed and celebrated through dedicated floats. One included a float with a large banner reading Afro-Americans, while others honored technical advancements in transportation, car culture, and local clubs, including the Rotary Club. Another float presumably was celebrating westward expansion and settlement, and it was dedicated to the first cabin. And while parades commemorate history in the present moment, the Golden Potlatch also conjured a very specific idea of the future, one that was distinctly linked to economic prosperity and to the will for a collective redistribution of wealth offered by the purposefully borrowed idea of the potlatch, the Indigenous ceremony that takes place along the Northwest Coast. So the celebration of different races and classes as part of the Golden Potlatch mirrored actually the permutations of assumed hierarchies and divisions between race, class, and gender that took place during both the Klondike Gold Rush as well as prior ones. Because this was perhaps, as far as I can tell in my research, one of the first instances when cross-dressing was not only tolerated but encouraged in North American culture, and Calamity Jane is one example. So the existence of gold radically leveled the playing field because everyone, regardless of their background, where they came from, which language they spoke, whether they're rich or poor or in between, had the potential to strike it rich. And this potential nearly trumped all the former divisions. And during this time, moral codes, values, and ethics were hybridized, and in some cases invented anew. And with this came vernacular forms of law and social justice as well. So I always love to show this slide because I have no idea what these hooded rabbits are doing in the parade, but they're there and they're part of the Golden Potlatch. So unlike traditional potlatch ceremonies, the festivities associated with the Golden Potlatch, there were no goods, materials, or other tokens that were gifted or exchanged. In customary potlatch ceremonies, goods in the form of both material and immaterial wealth are generally given with the intention that they're paid back at a future date with interest. So potlatches, each with their very specific associations and intentions, depending on the local context, because they're very different in each community, are one way in which Indigenous societies honor ancestors. They give names, we repay debts, we share resources, we settle disputes, and we instill social values. Peter Lamborn Wilson puts forward that the idea of spiritual anarchy, what he calls, arising from the appropriation of native beliefs and traditions, is in fact America's oldest heritage. So relative to the Golden Potlatch, this perhaps points to both a desire for economic prosperity along with the obligatory and ceremonial sharing of wealth. So this is a pretty fascinating image as well, and I'll explain what this is in a second. So we know that the Golden Potlatch was an invention of 4 of the country's earliest advertising men. They're not named in text, actually, and they came from the ranks of Seattle's largest downtown promoters. So it included the Chamber of Commerce, both major newspapers, the Post-Intelligencer and the Seattle Times, and the brand new Seattle Advertising Club. And the Golden Potlatch was a self-declared advertising stunt, and the origins of the festival they describe as follows. So organizers explain that they borrowed the term potlatch from the quaint jargon of the Chinook. Chinook, not a people actually, but a kind of term used by newcomers to the land that in their minds meant a carnival of sports, music, dancing, and feasting, and the distributing of gifts by host to all the guests. So essentially, they developed an extended Indian fantasy to suggest the exotic and mysterious character of the potlatch, and they even named it. So they called themselves the Tillacoons of the Ilteus, and they formed a secret order, and it's no surprise that all 4 men were supposedly Freemasons. And the narrative that they shaped was that the highest Tyee, they called him, or the chief of the North, had indeed paddled to Seattle to visit his white brethren in the South, as though there are no other people aside from white people in the South as well. He was attended by leaders of 5 Alaskan tribes, each represented by a contrived totem. So the highest Tyee, the chief, shared his knowledge of the picturesque and romantic Indian North with potlatch visitors, and in return, the city of Seattle offered him access to the ways of modernity. So obviously implying that those advertising men, even though they needed the chief to come south from Alaska, they implied that he was indeed not modern. This is an image of people in their regalia celebrating a potlatch in Alaska, just as to give you a sense of the contrast. So the specific ceremony that the Golden Potlatch was conjuring remains integral to Tlingit society and Haida society in Alaska and in the Yukon, and it's practiced today. And the memorial ceremony that most closely resembles what we now call a potlatch is called a ku'eks, and it's central to both the spiritual and healing dimensions of Tlingit societies because it commemorates the recently deceased, and it takes place usually a year after someone has passed. And during the event, as it's practiced now, a community hall or a big house, if a community has that, is stacked with food and other material goods, and this ranges from berries or apples and oranges, bread, candy, juice, blankets, soft drinks, and other special gifts that are meant to be given to specific individuals. But the most sacred of objects, the atau, they're not publicly displayed. They're instead kept in decorated chests out of sight until they're actively used as part of the ceremony. And this includes the robes, the regalia that's worn at the start of the ku'eks, as well as part of all of the dances. It is the atau, the most highly valued items, cultural belongings in Tlingit society, that are in fact considered masterless or ownerless. So they are so powerful that no single human can own them. You can only be their caretaker. So clan groups collectively act as their stewards in perpetuity. And currency now, in the form of paper money, has also entered the ceremonial realm through its integration into the ku'eks. So small amounts are exchanged as a symbolic gesture of support rather than a display of competitive wealth. And they're given discreetly to friends and relatives of the opposite moiety. So moiety being one of two kinship houses that makes up a specific community. Where I'm from, we are raven and wolf. So the names of those who have given are later publicly acknowledged through a statement. But I wanted to contrast these two images for another reason as well, because I think it's important to, and we'll be going back even farther in time, because I'm going to quote Walter Benjamin. And he says that the mimetic faculty represents not only the desire to illustrate or embody characteristics that are desired in the other, but it's in fact born from the very compulsion to become the other, so to become the other. So there is an image that used to circulate as part of the Golden Potlatch, but unfortunately it was too low res for me to share with you. And it shows the four creators of the festival, and they themselves are dressed up in stunning, authentic, woven raven's tail ceremonial robes, along with traditional headpieces, and they're each holding an elaborately carved paddle and staff. So here, they're quite literally taking on the identity and the myth of their own devising, and they're becoming the fictitious Alaskan chiefs who paddled down from the north in search of modernity. We're nearing the end here, but I thought that this was a moment of genius marketing because they were ad men after all. So in a moment of genius marketing, the men behind the Golden Potlatch created the perfect mascot for their event, and they called it the Potlatch Bug. It emerged in 1912 during the second iteration of the summer festival, and it became the event's emblem and highly recognizable brand. And represented in a style now typical of the aesthetics of Northwest Coast native art, it had its face painted in red and white with black form lines, and the bug was both insect and human-like. It had a decorated crest on its forehead, it had kohl-rimmed eyes and claw-tipped fingers, and they said that the bug's most primary characteristic was its infectious grin. Through their marketing campaign, the organizers pointed to an intriguing link between the desire for economic prosperity and sickness. Because the purpose of their mascot was, and this is their words, to inoculate you with carnival spirit. And they even went so far as to invent a bug high priest, a figure who merged religion with the organizers' understanding of the potlatch. The hypothetical virus that was to infect Seattle's populace even had a name. They called it enthusiastamitis. And the initiation into the Golden Potlatch Club included a mock injection of the sacred virus of the great bug. So it doesn't get any better than this, right? So with what one can imagine was a combination of religious zeal with the focus of ritual, this injection was administered by an ad club member who attended the meeting in full regalia. But going back even farther in time, Pierre Burton similarly describes the effect of the Klondike Gold Rush as a malady or as a sickness. In his words, he said, "So infectious was the Klondike epidemic that even the flimsiest rumor served to send hundreds dashing to the farthest corners of the northern hemisphere." And end quote. So the Golden Potlatch, with its performative rhetoric of sickness associated with capitalist desire, I think, enacts the symptoms of Western colonialism, inextricably linked with capitalism, while at the same time constituting a public acknowledgement of its existence, and not only of its existence, but of its violence. And in this instance, perhaps revealing a need, if one that was deeply buried, in the colonial actors, and that is to be healed. Because after all, the ku'eks, so the potlatch ceremony, is a ceremony for healing, even if they didn't know it when they were making the Golden Potlatch. So those producing the Golden Potlatch clearly saw a link between economic prosperity and collective belief. So they understood that the very belief in potential wealth, that is, the idea that the economy will too soon take a turn, can indeed transform economies in the real. So with the QX, the production and distribution of wealth ensures the health of the community, and that societal values and obligations are upheld in perpetuity. But I wonder what kind of values the Golden Potlatch was putting forward. So the mimesis that was brought forth by the Golden Potlatch was decidedly imperfect. From the outset, its intent, I think, was not to create a perfect copy, but it was to borrow from the idea of the potlatch for very different objectives and for very different means. So the festival was the public performance of a larger narrative about future economic prosperity, always already from the settler's perspective. It was a form of emetic excess framed by individual desire for wealth and power, made possible by the conjuring of modern-day capitalism. Perhaps to fully enter modernity, it was necessary for Seattle to perform this mimesis, to experience the freedom to live reality as really made up. But it was in this moment of creative freedom and the quite liberal bastardization of other economic values, fueled by generalized understandings of the potlatch, that it indeed achieved some of what Marcel Mauss proposed for hybridized economies in his book, The Gift. So Mauss wrote that these concepts of law and economies that it pleases us to contrast, liberty and obligation, liberality, generosity, and luxury, as against savings, interest, and utility, it would be good to put them in the melting pot once more. So he argues for the re-recognition of the value of reciprocity and exchange, something that for him forms the very basis of social life, and indeed for us. So here I want to bring you back to Quiche. This is an image of Skookum Jim, who's my great-grandmother's uncle. And he was one of the three, if you already didn't get that, he was one of the three co-discoverers of the Klondike Gold Rush, but he's often not named in text because he was one of the quote-unquote native guides. So after witnessing the events of the White Pass and the Chilkoot Trail, Quiche knew that this hunger would not be satiated, that this sickness of capitalism had no conventional cure. The fever for gold was like an addiction. A taste only produced desire for more. Prospectors, they thought of nothing, of lying, of cheating and stealing, even murder, to acquire it. There was no room for morality in their hollowed out souls. By the time that the prospectors and speculators had made their way over the icy mountain passes, everyone was infected, and their manifestations were physical. Quiche came to recognize the symptoms. He saw the empty look in their eyes, the frenzied pace at which they did everything. A new kind of desire seemed to drive them. And this gold fever was not anonymous, like the ones that had afflicted San Francisco, Deadwood, the Black Hills, Barkerville, and other sites in the decades before. This one earned its own name. It was called Klondiotitis. The newcomers were not the only ones afflicted. A transformation was starting to take place in the native populace as well. And like most things, it was foretold first in a story. And he said, "They're coming now." He sings them some kind of song. He tells them, "I'm going to be the white man." No one knows Ko'uchen at the time. That boy called them Ko'uchen. He said, "Ko'uchen you, Ko'uchen that one. Turn that way, all that camp. You fellows, you all going to be white." That's what he said. They don't know what he means. You're going to be the way, you're going to be that way, and you're going to turn to white man. What white man? That time, nobody knows it. The news initially spread through whispers. It was conjured in visions and in dreams. The Ikt, or the medicine people, they foretold the arrival of tens of thousands of men, their faces all drained of color. They called them Ko'uchen. They called them the cloud people. According to the Icht, these men all spoke hurriedly in strange tongues. Words rushed out of their mouths like water. And their world was a colorless world. It was a place where everything, the plants, the animals, even the fish, were white. This winter world deeply troubled the Icht. Their many gatherings considered the implications of their visions, the pending appearance of these newcomers, and this whiteness that seeped over the lands. Soon after the appearance of the first Coatchen, they saw the color begin to drain from our faces too. Our world was also turning white. It wasn't just appearances that were strange, behaviors also turned odd. We began forgetting things. Initially, it was just a few words, then parts of stories, then entire songs. When the songs disappeared, we no longer remembered the dances. One by one, we started forgetting our languages. Wealth was no longer communally gifted, but closely guarded. The prophecy of the arrival of the newcomers to the Yukon predicted the infectious character of this new world. In it, religion replaced spirituality, greed supplanted reciprocity, and economy superseded trade. Its attendant symptoms were physical as well as cultural. Whiteness and gold fever were not the only illnesses affecting the people of the Yukon at the time, because everyone was sick with diseases that were distinctly biological as well. There were recurring waves of influenza, smallpox, tuberculosis, and this caused the breakdown of Tlingit clan systems and customs. These sicknesses first came with the Russians, the fur traders who arrived on the northwest coast into the Arctic in the 1740s. British ships came at their heels, and then Spanish ships, with new diseases accompanying new goods. At first, it was thought that the plagues would pass, but then they struck again and again. Whole families were decimated, then entire villages were wiped out. And by the late 1800s and the onset of the rush, families were already small and spread out. The loss of life put the Icht, or the medicine people, into a state of crisis. They were desperate. They began to hold ceremonies to the point of exhaustion, realizing too late that their medicines couldn't heal these new illnesses. Their entire belief systems were thrown into upheaval. They began having new visions. They saw the land flayed, gutted, and left to rot. They witnessed men like ants crawling into open crevices and carrying out all that was inside. These prophecies, as dark as they were, as dark as they are, they also offered the means to navigate this new world, and therefore the ability to survive unprecedented change, because we did. We survived. For Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner, the ongoing presence of Indigenous peoples in the Americas is not merely survival, it is survivance. For Visner, survivance denotes active resistance. It is, in his words, the repudiation of dominance, obtrusive themes of tragedy, nihilism, and victimry. The continued resistance and very existence of Indigenous peoples works against the machine of empire of capital. The apparatus that first desires territory, then exploits its resources, and then eventually turns everything, even people, into commodities. The figure of the survivant, as opposed to a mere survivor, might offer a way to think in a destabilizing, defamiliarizing, and that is in a queer way, about Indigenous modes of contemplation and habitation. And that's his words. Artist and storyteller, our elder, now past Kitty Smith, who was Tagish and Tlingit, she recounted a tale of a young boy who walked between the old world and the new. Upon returning from his journey, he relayed some of the stranger's customs and predicted the pending transformation in his own community. So she says, in recalling this story, that he enters the unfamiliar dimension by walking under a rainbow, and he receives instruction about what to eat, a bag of special white man's food, and a special song, all of which he is able to bring back with him. He returns to teach people about the habits of these strangers before they physically arrive. He predicts that eventually everyone will become white men. The story of the young boy is also the story of a survivant, a figure who calls out the way in which this whiteness will begin to infect the population, as it is not only consumed by them, but also enacted upon them. Yet yet in identifying these early symptoms of assimilation, he's not succumbing to it. He is not playing the victim. He is also seeking a way to counter its spread. So to conclude, what if we begin treating capitalism like the infection it is? Can we look into its dark heart to start treating this wound? And with that, I end. Hi, everyone. Still hear me well?
Thank you, Candice.
You're welcome.
So I want to say thank you for your lecture. I think that there's a lot of narratives that you were speaking upon that were really relating to kind of right now where we're at, and kind of thinking about spirituality, the land, capitalism, kind of the fears that we have. I'm wondering, right now we don't have any questions, but can you talk maybe a little bit about why we decided, or why you wanted to move forward with this lecture at this time again?
Yeah, it was actually out of a conversation that we had, Ashley, because I realized that I had been thinking about the infectious nature of capitalism for a long time, as I said at the beginning. And in thinking through it, the reason that I wrote these papers, and that they've been writing that I've actually been working on for the better part of a decade, and I continue to work on, because I now have what I call a Potlatch trilogy of essays. The first one was actually the Golden Potlatch, which I found by a complete surprise. Actually, I was asked to write an essay on Potlatch, and I wasn't quite sure where to begin. And I don't know how I stumbled upon it, but I started seeing these images, and a lot of them I shared with you, and they were unbelievable. These images of these people walking with totem poles on their heads, and these images of this parade to try to sort of link the prosperity of Alaska with the prosperity of the continental US at a time just following a great economic depression. And I was thinking through, why has the gold rush always been described, even by our people, as a kind of infection? Does that mean then that capitalism has an infectious nature as well? And I think it's true, because a lot of us, the deeper I went and the more that I researched, I realized that it was indeed described by people then. And some of what I read were testimonies from elders who've since passed. But one of the things that really stuck with me when I was doing some of this writing was when I relayed to you that story of Skookum Jim, how he finds the copper-sided frog, and the frog turns, and the eyes, instead of eyes, he has gold nuggets. I had made that up. I knew that he found the frog, and Skookum Jim had always, because wealth for Tlingit people is not something that an individual can carry. It's something that's bestowed on you. And wealth is not simply monetary wealth, but it's actually your ability to take care of your community. So that means that your ability to, feed your community, to be a good leader in your community. And I knew that he always equated that discovery of those nuggets that led to the gold rush on El Dorado Creek, or Bonanza Creek, to the frog. But so when I wrote that, I was doing more research, and I found 172 pages of a testimony given by his nephew to folks who were doing research for what's now called the Skookum Jim Friendship Center. And in the middle of that document, his nephew described how Skookum Jim always said that frog had gold for eyes. And when I heard that, I thought, this is crazy. And actually I had to stop writing for a couple of weeks, because then I realized that, stories are interesting things. I think stories always find their ways through, even if, and at that time I felt like I was simply a conduit for that story. And then it made me think, why is this story being shared with me at this time? Like, what can we learn from it now? So that's why I wanted to share this story at this moment now, because I think that there's actually some teachings in it for what we're going through at the moment. They're not equivalent by any means, but I think that, we can carry these teachings with us now. Okay, so
So
I'm reading this from George.
Yeah, from George Sissel, who is my one of my dear mentors. So he says that in addition to the business and political leaders of Seattle co-opting the potlatch for their capitalist purpose, was the religious missionary community also complicated?
Or also complicit? Is that what
Complicit,
you
sorry.
mean? Complicit, I think. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I explained some of this, but it was a very long, convoluted presentation. Is that essentially, you know, when they invented the golden potlatch, they were inventing it for one as a means to boost Seattle's economy. But I thought it was interesting. The more that I researched into the background of these men, and I found that they were Freemasons. But also, yes, as far as I can tell, definitely the churches were a major part of it because they have congregations. And when you're trying to, you know, create a mass gathering, you look to where people already gather, and churches are part of it. And I also thought that, you know, the kind of also mimicry, like they call themselves, they use the term the bug high priest. So obviously they were already borrowing from the kind of terminology of Western religion too in inventing what they did. So that's a great question. Thank you. And if anyone else has questions, like even really basic ones, feel free to put them in the chat. Be happy to answer them. And Ashley, if you have others, I can answer them too.
I think there's one more thing. There's a couple of things that stuck out in your lecture. One of the things that I wrote down while you were talking was the fact that there was like the community cares and the exhaustion of performing healing. And then I'm also just thinking to kind of the performative action of like performing sickness and the way that the potlatch was co-opted. And if there's any, you know, overlay or like in ways of like how like one group is like looking at like exhaustion and like doing and healing for their own and taking care of their own, but then there's also this like performative exhaustion and practice of like performing the sickness and what that might mean.
Yeah, that's an interesting intersection. So when I was describing the medicine people as performing ceremonies to the point of exhaustion, of course, I'm speculating a bit, but I also think that that's probably what was happening because people were trying to use the means that they had to deal with these new illnesses, but unfortunately the means that they had weren't curing them. So we're a little bit in the same situation. So they ended up just sort of repeating and repeating ceremonies and hoping that something would start to change and to shift. And because I think one of the things that I didn't mention, but I think is pretty common knowledge, is that 90% of the Indigenous population, which they estimate there was between 60 to 112 million people living in the Americas before the main group of newcomers started coming. And so 90% of those folks passed away. But being on the West Coast, that meant that, the Russians started trading relatively late, only in the 1740s, and then the British came after them. And so the kind of waves of sickness that we felt actually came much later. But also a lot of the sickness actually came from trade items first. So items that were traded overland introduced diseases even before people came on the ships. So I was really thinking about, what would you do in that situation? How would you try to fix and heal your community? But at the same time, I was really overlaying that to think about, to think deeper about why they really felt like in Seattle they needed the potlatch at that moment in time. And they needed it because they wanted a way for that wealth, that supposed wealth and all the potential gold that was still there in Alaska to come to them so that they could spread it among themselves. But I also really do believe, and when I came to this point in the essay, when I kind of realized, like, I wonder if they knew that potlatches weren't just about spreading wealth, and with wealth, it wasn't monetary wealth, it was like food and things like that, and governance structures and names, but that potlatches were for communities to get together to heal one another, in fact. So it was an act of reciprocal healing. It was a very complex social structure, the structure of reciprocal healing. So it actually made me a little bit more optimistic about what their aims were. And I don't know, fully what their aims were, but I think that there might have been an interest in healing. And it looks like there's some bigger questions coming in here.
Yeah, and there's also 2 questions on the Q&A. So there's one question that's asking, so you're saying capitalism is bad or dangerous? And if so, what is the alternative?
Yeah, well, I think that it's very complex. What I was seeing was that just through this one example, and this is an early example of what I would consider to be hypercapitalism, because it was focusing on one good, and that one good was gold. And it showed how that search for just that one single good was transforming very radically society, so that everyone was absolutely fixated on it to the point where, and I wasn't exaggerating when I said people would forget to eat, they'd forget to take care of themselves because they were all searching for gold. So yeah, I think capitalism inherently can make us very individualistic, non-communal, because we want to, accumulate. Capitalism at its heart makes us want to accumulate things. So, but it was also the reason that a lot of our lands, Indigenous lands, were exploited. So I'd say it's very complex. I think that some people believe that there's ways of having a kind of hybrid system, kind of social capitalist system, but I'm sure everyone has thoughts on that. Yeah. Okay, here's some more questions.
One here in the Q&A, I wonder if you could comment on the unifying nature of the current epidemic and how that connects to our behavior and demand to retain a sense of normalcy economically, largely through technology as a way to unify.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Zandra, thanks. Yeah, so one of the things that I was curious about, and we're in the midst of it, so it's really hard to kind of get a bigger picture view, but one of the things that I saw almost immediately is people responding to social isolation by actually reaching out to see what other folks needed and creating these other networks of trade, actually, and gifting and regifting. So for me, I think it's always interesting when these other systems break down what comes to fill their place. And I was really heartened to see that, all of these groups were starting to, like neighborhood groups, to see what people might need in a neighborhood. Seed sharing started again in earnest. So I do think that some of those things have a way to unify, but because overall what we're learning in this time of the pandemic is that it itself is a unifier, but it also exposes any weakness, no matter race or class. It exposes any weakness in a system. So that is another kind of unifying agent, even if it's one that's really hard to take at the moment. Okay, and see, Joseph, you're asking what was the excerpt that you read about the whiteness myth of losing languages and songs. So those are testimonies that were taken by Julie Cruikshank, who's a woman who's taught for a long time at the University of British Columbia, and she worked up in our region in the Yukon, actually since the 70s. So a lot of those testimonies are taken from our elders, like Kitty Smith, who I mentioned, who's a relative of ours, among many others. And I think that the one that I read about whiteness was actually by Angela Sidney. So she's a Tlingit elder, or wasn't a Tlingit elder. She's since passed from the Yukon. So it's a great question.
And it looks like we have a question from Facebook that says, I've started seeing more narratives describing capitalism as a disease and infectious these days, such as the movie Parasite that recently won Best Picture at the Oscars. Why do you think all these narratives and our current circumstances with COVID-19 and socio-political election issues are all seeming to be co-escalating at this point in time?
That's a great question. That's my question too. That's also why I wanted to give this talk, because I'm still figuring out what the answer is. It is really interesting. Parasite came at a really opportune moment in a way for us to think about social or class divides as generating from capitalist systems. Absolutely. So I don't know why yet, but I think it's really curious. And there was a kind of return to my thinking around this at the same time as well. So, yeah. And then this question from Joseph, which I can read out actually if you want. He says, I believe Peter Lamborn Wilson may have discussed mummers in Philly as an artifact of long-lasting ritual traditions of that infectious ritual type, like those in Belgium still, and wonder if he might have observations to offer on the Golden Potlatch as an example of your traditions being grafted by the, I like that term, grafted by the settlers on extractive colonization. This written by an ex-Seattleite who suffered through the hydroplane noise of the seafarer, which you describe as the Golden Potlatch's survival, which it is actually. When you look at it, the seafarer celebrations came out of that. But any person I spoke to from Seattle had no idea that that was indeed the origins of that celebration. But I agree. I'm sure Peter Lamborn Wilson, if he ever reads the essay, might agree that that is indeed it. And the reason that I quoted him is because he's one of the few people, like he wrote, Joseph, you might have to remind us the title of this book, where he really goes into the kind of origins of spiritual anarchy in the United States. But I do think that it is one of the kind of original belief systems here is this hybridization, but often people don't write about that, the kind of hybrid nature of Indigenous belief systems and belief systems that were brought over to form new ones, or graft new ones, as you might say. So thank you for all those questions. They're really good ones. I really hope everyone enjoyed the lecture. It was really fun to give. It was a totally different experience for me. And I just want to thank also Ashley and everyone at DiverseWorks for hosting me.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us live from New Mexico and taking the time. I think it's really exciting that we could have this conversation and move forward with your lecture. If there's one more question, and I think this will be the last question, and then we'll go ahead and shift for the evening. There's a question on Facebook. Reyes. Maya, do you happen to see that question? Okay. Why use mimesis as opposed to exploitation or appropriation?
Yeah, I think as soon as you say appropriation, people immediately think it's bad. And I was wanting to use mimesis because I think what they're doing is copying, and to look and to make that gesture of the copy a much more complex act than the simple appropriative one. Certainly, even mimetic acts are about power, right? About the right that you have to someone else's image as well, or the thought that you think that you have the right to someone else's image. Also, because at the time, I think I was reading a lot of Michael Taussig and Walter Benjamin, which I don't read so much of anymore, not for any particular reason, but I was kind of following their ideas of mimesis and also the kind of mimetic excess, you might call. And so I think that those kinds of ideas and writing for me, I found a lot of through lines through, whereas a lot of writing around indigeneity and appropriation tend to be a lot more shut down. That's just my opinion.
I have one last question for you, Candice, and this is more towards your curatorial practice. I'm wondering how the stories and your research in the Golden Potlatch and other narratives from the Klondike community impact your curatorial practice.
Yeah, I guess they do in particular ways. So I guess in my curatorial practice, I've always been interested in who there's space made for and who there isn't. From the beginning, that was an interest of mine. And quite a number of years ago, I was invited to this kind of a closed round table in Madrid. And I presented on the work of an artist named Bodic, who's since passed. And he participates in the Potlatch system. He's a maker of masks. He was a maker of masks. And I was really intrigued by this one gesture that he did, because I thought that it was a kind of interruption of the capitalist market, particularly with regards to the sale of Northwest Coast masks, the sale and trade of them, where, and I'll just give you a really short rundown, but basically halfway through an exhibition that he had at a commercial gallery in Vancouver, he took down 40 of the masks from the gallery walls, brought them back to his community in Alert Bay, because these are ceremonial masks. So even though he was displaying them, they're not actually for sale. And he burned them. And he burned them because when these masks, after they're danced 4 times, which doesn't necessarily mean over the span of 4 years, it could be a decade, just that those winter ceremonials have taken place, they're burned. And they're burned because then it creates the obligation to make new ones. So when new ones are made, it means that there's a apprenticeship system set up. The masks are made, the songs are learned, their names are known, and all 40 masks tell one particular story. So they're called the Atlakim masks. So I thought that this was a pretty fascinating gesture, artistic gesture. So I presented at it in the small forum of some pretty important people who've run curatorial programs and done major biennials and whatever. And they all collectively agreed that Beau's work was contemporaneous, but not contemporary art. And so I took that as a challenge, and I didn't back down. So I included that work as part of, when I was part of the curatorial team for Documenta 14, because I thought, if somehow we consider the realm of contemporary art to be always malleable and boundaryless, why can we not create or make enough space to understand the complexity of what this work is doing, both as a kind of particular kind of cultural practice, but also one that's enacting a certain kind of conceptual practice with regards to wealth and economies. And so when we included Beau's work in Documenta, I think it did create quite a bit of a shift. Some people, some critics couldn't sort of see how this was contemporary, even though, the surrealists all drew from Northwest Coast Mass. It's part of the development of modernism. And they also, some people couldn't close the gap between understanding this as a current practice. They want to always think of it as a past practice. That's also why I wanted to show it. And then I wrote an essay called Outlawed Social Life out of that. So I kind of see them often going in tandem. Like sometimes what I'm thinking and writing about then informs kind of curatorial practice and vice versa.
Thank you. Well, I think that that's it for tonight in terms of questions. Thank you so much, Candice, for joining us. It's been an amazing opportunity to talk with you. I'm so sorry that we didn't get to have an opportunity to bring you to Houston. Usually you're here and it's a whole week-long process, but I've enjoyed the time that I've gotten to Zoom and Skype with you. Thank you all for our attendees for attending tonight's DiverseWorks Discourse. This is our first online discourse, so making history. It will be posted and online on our website as well as on Facebook, so you can reference it back if you're looking for more material. Me and Candice and I did talk about us also linking her writings that inspired tonight's lecture. So those will be available as well. And you can visit our website, which is www.diverseworks.org. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone. Bye.